We continue to follow some major news of the day. You're taking a live look at the Supreme Court as President Biden has now called for a number of reforms to be made as it relates to the Supreme Court. He unveiled those earlier today, really long-awaited proposals for changes, calling on Congress to establish term limits and an enforceable ethics code for the court's 9 justices. He is also pressing lawmakers to ratify a constitutional amendment limiting presidential immunity. One of those, of course, again, being no immunity for crimes a former president committed in office. The second of those proposed reforms, term limits for Supreme Court justices. And that third, the binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. I do want to bring in Seth Berenzweig, who is an attorney, to talk more about this. And Seth, thank you for taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me back.
So, this perhaps comes as no surprise, but President Biden likely will face an uphill battle as he is calling on Congress to make these reforms. Can you kind of break down those 3 major points that the White House has issued today? And of course, President Biden writing that op-ed in one of the papers earlier this morning.
Sure. So the 2 headlines as it relates to the Supreme Court is a recommendation for the imposition of term limits. That's a concept that has been around the block before here in Washington. The House of Representatives actually just a couple of years ago provided that kind of a recommendation, and it didn't really go anywhere with a proposed law for an 18-year term limit. So the first is the notion of term limits for Supreme Court justices. The second relates to a binding code of ethics. This has certainly been a really hot topic lately. Justice Thomas has been kind of the canary in that coal mine with his apparent luxurious trips that have been funded by some conservative interests. And then that was followed up and perhaps made even worse on the optics by not exactly reporting those on a timely basis. So that's a concept that the Supreme Court, even to this day, hasn't followed up on. The third aspect, which is a little bit more indirect, is the notion of a potential constitutional amendment with regard to executive immunity. That's something that is really much more of a long-term play. With respect to the first 2 points, these are ideas with respect to Supreme Court reform that at first blush really have some attractiveness to it. Overall, Americans are in favor of term limits, and in fact, roughly 70% of Americans are in favor of term limits. Ironically, they also favor them for the members of Congress. So the concept is an interesting one, but as you've noted, the devil's in the details.
Yes, and it's interesting because President Biden, he's supporting a system where a president would appoint a justice every 2 years to spend 18 years in active service. Those who do not support term limits and really that lifetime appointment, they're advocating for the lifetime appointment to perhaps remove any sort of political bias or political pressure. This has been a year, though, where we have seen a lot of political discussion surrounding the justices, very likely contributing to President Biden's recommendations. How does that play out?
Well, it certainly plays out at a unique time in our nation's history because certainly we're really kind of heading towards the 9th inning as far as the presidential election is concerned. And although I have a lot of respect for the president, and again, the idea in general is something that has some popularity among Americans, it really does have perhaps a little bit of a tinge of political pandering to it. It looks like something where it's maybe just a political football that he's trying to toss to his vice president to try to score a touchdown in the end zone. The reality is that there has been a lot of controversy with the Supreme Court lately, not only with respect to issues regarding Justice Alito and his flags and Justice Thomas and his trips, but of course you have the Dobbs decision and you have a number of these other monumental decisions. So now you have a renewal, if you will, of some calls that have already been around for a couple of years in Congress. And in fact, President Biden, even before all these controversies, formed a task force to even look at this issue. So the timing of this is interesting. The United States Congress has the authority under the Constitution to make this change. The Constitution only sets forth that there shall be created a Supreme Court of the United States, but it's the Congress that has the purse strings. It's the Congress that, in earlier points of American history, has expanded the court from 6 to 9. Whether, of course, the United States Congress is in any shape to do this, given its current political divide, is very unlikely at any time in the near future.
So again, as you mentioned, Seth, this does seem to be a little bit of political theater where President Biden is making a strong stance on an issue where he's likely not to succeed in.
I don't think it's really going to go anywhere right now. The more realistic approach, and again, I think that the idea in a vacuum is quite a popular one, but a more realistic way to do it, if this president or the next one wants to have this go, is why not put this in with a notion of term limits that apply to both of the branches of the federal government. Let it apply to Congress as well. There were quite a number of people that couldn't help but notice that Dianne Feinstein was well into her 90s at the time that she was unable to start to attend hearings to perform her duties. And sadly, she passed away at the time where she was still a member of Congress. So this is something that ultimately could happen. But I think the only way for it to get broad support is for it to appear to be nonpartisan. And the best way to do that is to have it apply in an equal and broad fashion to both of the constitutional branches of government, to the Congress, as well as to the Supreme Court.
Seth, before we let you go, is there anything else specifically that you find interesting when it comes to those three major points of reform and also the timing of this proposal?
Well, the timing, I think, as you've correctly noted, speaks a little bit for itself. With respect to the constitutional amendment, just keep in mind that that's a long road. I think we can agree that the idea of the United States Congress implementing the first two of the three changes is something that is just not going to happen between now and then. The likelihood of a constitutional amendment with regard to presidential immunity is somewhere between slim and none, and I think Slim already left town. I don't see that happening at any point within the next several years.
All right, Seth, as always, a pleasure speaking with you here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate it.